What is going on? Headliner Nation, Jake, Fantasy Headliners. Hopefully everybody's doing well out there for Week 12 Fantasy Football, where we're talking about some running backs and who should we start and sit. But first and foremost, we want to make sure we tell everybody out there, happy Thanksgiving to you and your families. We are very thankful over here for all the support that you've shown us here over the past few years. But we got to talk some fantasy football, right? Because the playoffs are right around the corner, and we have to make some good decisions here in Week 12. But there's a lot of backfields that you just got to throw darts on, right? Well, we started throwing blind darts last week, and it worked out pretty well. 3 out of the 5 blind darts that I just threw at a backfield actually hit. So you know what? We're going to do it again here this week. However, before we get into Week 12, how did we do in Week 11 at the running back position? And I can't complain at all. A great week at the running back position last week, where we had a total of 58 players we gave a start or sit designation to that completed their games this past week, and 43 of them were correct for an accuracy percentage of 74%. A few of the bigger misses on the week: Melvin Gordon, Denver Broncos. He decided he really wanted to play football for once this season. It looked like he was great. He was a miss. Frank Gore, the immortal one, he found the end zone. And Jonathan Taylor, Dilly Dilly himself, out of the pit of misery and had himself a pretty solid game, which could have been better if not for a costly penalty. Some of the biggest hits: Kenyon Drake came out, looked healthy, looked great, scored a touchdown, people were happy. Antonio Gibson continues to impress and really help out a lot of fantasy owners down the stretch here once again. And then Carlos Hyde, he was a late addition, right? During the rankings episode, we found out that he was going to be active. No Chris Carson, told everybody to get him in their lineups, and he came out and had himself a very solid week as well. So overall, a great week in Week 11, but now we got to do the same thing here in Week 12. And we have a few games early in the week that we need to talk about on Thanksgiving Day. Starting off the triple header here this week with the Houston Texans and Detroit Lions. I mean, this is an absolute dream matchup for running backs, right? Kicking off Thanksgiving with a great matchup where some running backs can have some big games. Now, both of these teams, they allow over 26 fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. That's absolutely amazing. What's not amazing? Duke Johnson of the Houston Texans has been the complete opposite of amazing. I mean, for his career coming into this season, he was averaging 4.5 yards per carry for his entire career. So far here in 2020, 2.8 yards per carry, which is not good, like not at all. And he's absolutely killing this opportunity that he has at being the lead back in Houston with no David Johnson. Now, over the past few weeks, it wasn't a bad idea to start Duke Johnson because of bye weeks and injuries. We really don't have a whole lot of that this week. No bye weeks, so you have probably more options on your roster. He's still going to go out there and get right around 15 touches, which isn't bad. Some people may need that. Maybe you have multiple flex spots. I just don't trust Duke Johnson at this point, regardless of the matchup. Sure, he could go out there and have a good game. He could also go out there and kill my week all by himself. This one's going to be a little bit dependent on what you have on your roster, but for me, I prefer to sit him. What about on the Lions side of things? Man, I was super high on DeAndre Swift last week, right? I think I had him ranked at like running back 6 overall. Super high. And then he got midweek concussed, and my dreams were absolutely shattered. And they haven't really been put back together as of yet. It's a great matchup for him, right, going up against Houston, but he still hasn't cleared concussion protocol. If the fantasy gods take away a matchup for DeAndre Swift against the Carolina Panthers and Houston Texans, I may have to go spider monkey on something, because this is an absolute horrible situation for DeAndre Swift owners, because you held on to him all year for matchups like this, and then you can't have him. If DeAndre Swift starts, he's absolutely in my lineup 100%. If he doesn't, maybe I'll lean, Kerryon Johnson over Adrian Peterson here this week if you're desperate. But regardless, I'm not overly high on either one of those guys, and they're not going to find their way in the start column this week. Second game up on Thanksgiving, Washington football team, Dallas Cowboys. Got a lot of questions during Saturday night's live stream about Ezekiel Elliott. Do I start him? Do I trade him? What do I do with him? Do I just bench him? And pretty much for everybody, we told him the same thing. You got to continue to start him. You can't trade him because his value's not high enough. You can't sit him just because of the potential ceiling that's out there. You got to just continue to roll with them. And then we saw this past Sunday why, right? He finished as running back 5 overall, had 23 total touches, plus Andy Dalton didn't look half bad in the passing game, which is only going to open up the running lanes for Ezekiel Elliott and allowed him to rush for over 100 yards for the first time in what feels like ages. Now, he may be having a down year as far as Zeke standards go, but he's still running back 6 overall in fantasy football, and now a matchup against Washington, where they average right around 17 fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. Got to continue to start Zeke. For Washington, I love me some Antonio Gibson here. He's going to be my Manscaped must-start player of the week. Now, just a reminder, after this video or this weekend, right, Black Friday through Cyber Monday, there's going to be some huge sales on Manscaped.com. Use our promo code HEADLINERS, all caps at checkout. Receive an additional 20% off plus free shipping. You don't want to miss out on these great deals here this weekend. Knock out a few of your Christmas presents here a few weeks early, then you don't have to worry about it the week before Christmas. But back to the football game and Antonio Gibson. This kid is on an absolute tear. Right now, overall in fantasy football, he's running back 10. Kind of want to shout out Matt Galloway a little bit. He brought up this guy way back in the offseason and said, dude, this is going to be the guy to own in Washington. And now it's actually happening, right? So he's running back 10 overall on the season. They just faced off against Dallas in week 7. He was running back 5 overall that week. Now, a few weeks ago, I compared him to kind of Aaron Jones, right? He's not one of those guys that needs huge volume. He's going to find the end zone a lot. He's going to have high ceiling days. And we're kind of seeing that happen, right? He's only had more than 33 snaps in a game once all year long. But he's found the end zone 8 times, has a touchdown in 4 straight games, and now gets a matchup going up against the Dallas Cowboys, who allow over 20 fantasy points per game. Yes, I'm starting Antonio Gibson this week. As for J.D. McKissic, we kind of saw last week a little bit of a downtick in the volume in the passing game. Why is that? Well, Alex Smith is starting to spread the ball around a little bit more in this offense. They're starting to open up the offense a little bit more. Plus, Terry McLaurin's an absolute beast on the outside. That's going to make J.D. McKissic a little bit more boom or bust and really dependent on huge volume in the passing game. So unless you're in one of the larger leagues, I'm going to go ahead and sit J.D. McKissic here this week. Last game up on Thanksgiving, Ravens and Steelers. Always a fun game to watch. However, we need to pay close attention to this over the next few hours because there's a real chance of some COVID restrictions happening in this game, right? A lot of positive tests popping up here as of late in Baltimore, and we really need to pay close attention to make sure we have a plan B just in case, because things got interesting really quickly here in Baltimore, right? I mean, we saw J.K. Dobbins last week, one of my blind dart throws saying, hey, this may be the week that J.K. takes over, and he had a great week. Then, almost immediately, the next day, him and Mark Ingram testing positive and basically ruled out for the game here this week. So now it's back to Gus Edwards almost by himself in this backfield, right? Which is great because now we don't have to make a decision who it's going to be this week. I can tell you it's going to be Gus Edwards. And I honestly really like Gus Edwards. His style really fits this offense, but it's a tough matchup. Pittsburgh allows 14 fantasy points per game, 4th best in the NFL to opposing running backs. But Gus led this backfield back in week 8 against this same Pittsburgh Steelers team. He had 16 carries for 87 yards and a touchdown and only saw 26% of the snaps. You have to think that that snap percentage is drastically going to increase with no J.K. Dobbins and no Mark Ingram. Is he an absolute smash must-start running back 1? No. He's going to be more the mid to low running back 2, but he is going to be a start because the chances of him seeing 20-plus touches are definitely there this week. For Pittsburgh, it was an improvement in Week 11 for James Conner. I guess we can say that. I mean, he had 99 total yards, had 6.85 yards per carry on the day. Not bad. But he only has 1 touchdown since Week 6. And that's a problem because the rushing totals haven't been there. We need those touchdowns to give us that safety on a weekly basis. Now, historically, James Conner doesn't do that great against the Ravens. In 6 games, he averages 11 touches and 43 yards. That right there does not scream excitement to start. However, this year, the Baltimore Ravens allowing right around 16 fantasy points per game. Still going to start James Conner, but he's going to be lower of a running back 2 for me this week. The ceiling, I just don't see it. He really needs to find the end zone this week to really outperform where we're going to have him ranked come into the week. Moving on to Sunday, first matchup up, Miami Dolphins, New York Jets. And is this the week that Myles Gaskin returns? Honestly, it's been pretty hush-hush, and nobody's heard a whole lot out of Dolphins camp to figure out whether or not he's coming back or not. I mean, Salvon Ahmed has, basically earned a timeshare there. That's just what we need in the NFL, right? Another timeshare, but the kid hasn't played half bad. Maybe they ease Gaskin back in. Maybe this is a little bit more of a split for the next few weeks. That's something we're going to have to pay attention to. And hey, I guess this is something we can thank Duke Johnson, right? This may be the best thing he's done all year because now there's not going to be a split when David Johnson comes back in Houston because Duke Johnson's basically blown. Had Ahmed actually sucked over the past couple weeks, there wouldn't be a question, right? When Gaskin comes back, it's his job. But now there's going to be a question mark in just another backfield here in the NFL. But they're going up against the Jets, who allow right around 19 fantasy points per game, and I really want to start one of these guys. As of right now, I'm starting Salvon Ahmed against this Jets team because as of right now, he is the starter. He hasn't been, demoted as of yet. They haven't activated Myles Gaskin. If they do, and they say that Myles Gaskin is going to be the starter here this week once again in this backfield, that he's 100%, I will transfer things over and make Myles Gaskin the start and sit Ahmed. But we really need to wait and see a little bit longer to find out what actually happens with Myles Gaskin. For the Jets, Thanos just continues to never age at this point, right? Because Frank Gore now is going to get more of an opportunity in this backfield because of the injury to La'Mical Perine. And Frank Gore is just going to be one of those guys who basically plays NFL football for the next 2 decades probably and just constantly has a safer floor. The ceiling's never going to be that high, but if he can continue to find the end zone like he did last week, it's not a bad matchup for him here this week against the Dolphins, right? They allow right around 20 fantasy points per game, and Frank Gore is a flex play. Isn't all that bad here in week 12. It depends on your options, but the volume should be there in a game that hopefully they can stay somewhat competitive in, and really allow Frank Gore to go out there and get you about 20 touches, because that's what we're looking for here this week out of Frank Gore. Cardinals and Patriots now, and the split continues in Arizona, right? Last week had a blind dart throw on Kenyon Drake. Ended up finishing running back 12 overall, and it worked out, right? However, Chase Edmonds also found the end zone, finished running back 14. So either way, it would have been a hit. They both produced, 10-plus fantasy points last week. However, Kenyon Drake still out-touched Chase Edmonds 15-6. And now there's a question about Kyler Murray. Is he going to be limited at all with a shoulder injury? If he is, does that mean they rely a little bit more on the running game out of the backfield with Kenyon Drake? Now, New England allows right around 18 fantasy points per game, and Kenyon Drake looked 100% last week. He did not look hampered by that ankle injury at all. Despite missing a game this season and already having his bye week, Kenyon Drake is still running back 17 overall. Now, I don't dislike Chase Edmonds whatsoever. He's just a little bit more touchdown dependent and isn't seeing enough volume to be a safe play on a weekly basis with Kenyon Drake in the lineup. For that reason, I'm starting Kenyon Drake here this week. For New England, we saw Sony Michel activated off the IR last week. Not, during the game, he did not play, but then we saw Rex Burkhead go down. We also saw James White with the most snaps that he's had in a game since week 4. Now, most of that's because Deshaun Watson was out there playing grown man ball, and he was absolutely dominating the Patriots, but what do we do going forward? Damian Harris has looked good when he's been given a chance. If Sony Michel comes back, does Damian Harris lose a few of those touches? More than likely, probably, but we really don't know if Michel's even going to play or not yet. The one thing that I'm really looking at is the increased snaps of James White. Now with no Rex Burkhead in the passing game, that's going to open up more opportunities for James White. James White is somebody who's excelled in passing work a lot in the past. If he can bump up those targets up to 7 to 8 targets a game, he all of a sudden becomes flex worthy once again. So here we go, throwing a blind dart this week on James White. James White's going to be the guy who I start in this backfield until we can see what type of role Sony Michel has going forward, if any, at this point. So James White, he's going to be the guy who I start in this backfield this week. Panthers and Vikings up next, and it sounds like another week without Christian McCaffrey, and really there's no reason for Carolina to rush him back at this point. But what's the biggest question mark here is the disappearance of passing work for Mike Davis. Why did they all of a sudden change the role that they found success with earlier in the season for Mike Davis? This isn't the type of guy who's going to be overly efficient on the ground. For his career, he only averages 3.7 yards per carry. But without that passing work, it really lowers his fantasy football ceiling. It takes away that safety, that safe floor. Going up against Minnesota, who allows right around 18 fantasy points per game, it's not a bad matchup, but Mike Davis hasn't been able to find the end zone more than one time over the last 5 games. Yeah, he's going to remain a start due to the volume he's going to see, but he's going to be a mid to low running back 2 for me. No more are the days of Mike Davis inside the top 12 until that passing work, actually comes back. For Minnesota, they got this guy what's his name? Dalvin Cook. Dalvin, I think that's what his name is. He's pretty good at football. I would probably recommend that you throw him in your lineup because the Panthers allow over 20 fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. That's pretty good itself. So, yeah, I think you may want to start Dalvin Cook this week. Browns and Jags, and Nick Chubb just continues to run up and down the field. Doesn't matter who he's playing, what day of the week it is, what the weather's like, Nick Chubb is going to be running. He now has over 100 yards rushing in 4 out of his last 5 games played, and he's running back 11 overall in fantasy football when it comes to fantasy points per game. Remember, he missed a few games, so his total points are going to be down a little bit, but his fantasy points per game, 11th best at 15 fantasy points per game. You know he's going to go out there and get right around 20 touches a week. You can almost bank on it. And now a matchup going up against Jacksonville, who allows right around 21 fantasy points per game, 7th most in the NFL. You're going to start Nick Chubb. For Kareem Hunt, people a little bit worried after last week, a little bit disappointed, myself included. Luckily, he found the end zone and kind of salvaged a pretty poor day overall, but it was a bad weather game. He only had 1 target in that game, so I'm really not reading too much into it. I'm going to start Kareem Hunt here once again as well. For Jacksonville, James Robinson doesn't care about injuries, doesn't care about matchups. He's just going to go out and run the ball effectively. Now, he was banged up prior to last week's game, going up against Pittsburgh, which is already a difficult matchup, still had 94 total yards in that game, but Pittsburgh got a lead. They really couldn't rely on the run much in Jacksonville's second half of that ball game, but this game against Cleveland should be a lot closer, right? You would think that it would be a lot of ground and pound in this game, more opportunities for James Robinson. Gonna have to start him here, obviously. He's only gone under 10 points in a ball game once this entire season. Gonna have to continue to roll him out there on a weekly basis. Titans and Colts, a rematch of a game that just happened a couple weeks ago, right? It's a tough matchup for Derrick Henry, but they just faced off in week 10, and in that ball game, he had 19 carries for 103 yards. We know he's a lock for basically 20 touches a week, and he's had over 100 yards rushing 4 out of his last 6 games played. Really no question here. Even though it's a tough matchup, you're still starting Derrick Henry. For Indianapolis, we're going back to throwing blind darts, right? Because on this episode last week, I said on paper, everything pointed to Nyheim Hines having a great game, which meant in 2020 verbiage that it was going to be a Jonathan Taylor game. I threw my blind dart anyway on Nyheim Hines, and it was a Jonathan Taylor game, which I'm not at all disappointed about. I mean, I want to see this kid succeed. I had high hopes for him coming into the season, but he finally had what I'm going to call his best game of the season because he had a 20-yard touchdown that was called back on a penalty. His great day could have been even better here this week. So now going forward, is this his backfield? Do they continue to give this volume to Jonathan Taylor? Do they continue to give him 20 carries on the ground? Because that's what he needs. He's a Derrick Henry style of running back. He's not an Aaron Jones type who only needs 10 to 12 touches and he's going to put up solid numbers. No, he needs to pound you for all 4 quarters. And then when you get, you worn down there towards the end of the game, that's where he makes you pay. That's how they need to utilize Jonathan Taylor. This week, I'm going to play blind darts. But it's kind of obvious on this one. But hey, just for the fun of it, throw my blind dart on. It's Jonathan Taylor this week. Let's give it to him going up against Tennessee and see if he can build some momentum here second half of the season. The talent is there, right? We've talked about it all year long. His biggest issue was his vision and his decision making. He looked a lot better at that this past Sunday, and let's hope he can build off it going forward. Giants and Bengals in the marquee running back matchup of Gio Bernard and Wayne Gallman. I mean, in all fairness, Wayne Gallman's been playing pretty well. Prior to their bye week, he'd had 4 straight finishes inside the top 16 in fantasy football. Also had touchdowns in all 4 of those games, and he did it against some difficult matchups. It wasn't a bunch of cream puffs that he was running over. He faced Philadelphia twice, Tampa Bay, Washington. Now he gets a matchup with Cincinnati, who allows 20 fantasy points per game. Absolutely, I'll start Wayne Gallman against Cincinnati. It's his best matchup he's had here in a month, and he provided great value in those games over the last month. So yeah, I'll fire him up as a flex play here this week. For Cincinnati, we know there's no Joe Mixon. We also know there's no Joe Burrow, and that blows. But does that mean that maybe they run the ball a little bit more? I have to think that Ryan Finley checks down a lot more than Joe Burrow does, and that could greatly benefit Gio Bernard. Is Gio a must start on a weekly basis? No. He's a flex play if needed in your lineup, but in a matchup going up against the Giants, who allow right around 20 fantasy points per game, and that potential of more checkdowns where Gio really excels, I'll throw him in my flex play here this week for week 12. Chargers and Bills, and we're getting scary close to a return of Austin Eckler. To me, it makes most sense week 13. Now, he has been activated, and he should practice this week on a limited basis. To me, They keep him limited this week. They see how he responds to practice. Next week, they give him a full go, a full week of full practice, and if he has no setbacks, he's good to go. He himself said just a few weeks ago that he was targeting a Week 13 return. That's next week, and that's what we're looking like right now for Austin Ekeler, but it's close. I mean, it's teetering on the chance that there's a chance he could play here this week, even though I don't think it happens, and I don't think it happens because of the way that Kalen Ballage is playing. He's actually been playing pretty well in this backfield. Had a slight injury scare last week, kind of limited him throughout the rest of that ball game. Couldn't put up huge numbers, but he's still getting the volume and he's still getting work in the passing game, which we love to see for somebody who's filling in as an injury fill-in, a bye week replacement, whatever it's been for you, for Kalen Ballage. He's been a pleasant surprise. Now going up against Buffalo, they allow right around 19 fantasy points per game. I'll start Kalen Ballage. If they activate and say that Austin Ekeler is good to go, I'll start Ekeler and sit Ballage, but I got to hear that and see it first. What about for the Buffalo Bills? Now, I did not miss this team whatsoever while they were on bye because this backfield is almost impossible to try to figure out. The Chargers allowed 19 fantasy points per game to opposing running backs, but who's it going to go to? You got Devin Singletary, you got Zach Moss, and they are in a true 50-50 split. Honestly, we're chasing the touchdown. They're not probably going to get more than one out of these two guys, but which one of these guys gets it is going to be the better start. So, what do we do in instances like this? We throw blind darts. This week, we're throwing it on Zach Moss. Zach Moss, even though he's getting similar touches to Devin Singletary, it's his touchdown upside, which is higher at this point. Being that we're chasing touchdowns, got to go with Zach Moss here this week in Week 12. Raiders and Falcons, and we're loving the touchdowns from Josh Jacobs. He's got 4 of them over the last 3 weeks, and it's got him all the way up to running back 5 overall in fantasy football. The Vegas Raiders just continue to focus on the run first. Even in a matchup against the high-powered offense of the Kansas City Chiefs, Josh Jacobs still had 17 carries out of the backfield, and now with at least 1 touchdown in 3 straight games, you know he has that high ceiling upside. Plus, even though you see Devontae Booker out there at times, Jacobs is the lead guy in this backfield. He saw 75% of the snaps just last week. Now, when you see the matchup going up against the Falcons, in the back of your mind, you may think, yes, great matchup, Josh Jacobs. Falcons are pretty good against the run. I mean, they allow 15 fantasy points per game, 5th best in the NFL to opposing running backs, but with this type of volume and this touchdown upside, you can't sit Josh Jacobs. Kind of what you see for Todd Gurley, too, on the Falcons side of things, right? Don't let last week scare you. A matchup going up against the New Orleans Saints. They are number 1 in the NFL against opposing running back. Prior to last week, he'd had at least 17 touches in 6 straight games. He's had at least 1 touchdown in 7 out of his 10 games played this season. Now he gets a much better matchup, going up against the Raiders, who allowed 22 fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. That's 4th most in the NFL. I have no issues, once again, firing up Todd Gurley here this week. Niners and Rams now, and I'm going to keep this one pretty simple for the San Francisco 49ers. There's a chance that Raheem Mostert returns this week. He is the only guy I'm interested in this backfield. We know no JaMycal Hasty, he's out. Jerick McKinnon, a little bit more boomer bust. A chance that Tevin Coleman comes back, but what has he done in San Francisco besides nothing? I'm only interested in Raheem Mostert if he's active and playing, because they're going up against the Rams, one of the best defenses in the NFL against opposing running backs, allowing only 13.5 fantasy points per game, 3rd best in the NFL. It's Mostert or nothing for me in this backfield here this week, so stay tuned. We'll see if he's active here by the weekend. For the Rams, we're going back to blind darts because all 3 of these guys, Cam Akers, Darrell Henderson, Malcolm Brown, they're all involved, but none of them are even getting 10 touches a game, which sucks. Now, you go at a matchup going against the San Francisco 49ers, who allow right around 16 fantasy points per game, which is 7th best in the NFL. Plus, none of these guys are involved in a passing game like whatsoever. Only 5 targets to running backs last week, split between 3 people. You do the math, it's not a lot. You know what? F it. I'm keeping my dart. I'm going to just sit all these guys because I want no part of this backfield here in Week 12. Saints and Broncos now, and we talked last week about Alvin Kamara and the concerns with Taysom Hill under center. Was I expecting it to be that bad? Not really. I was expecting a little bit of a decline from Alvin Kamara. Was I expecting no receptions from Alvin Kamara? No. That was the first game of his entire career without at least 1 reception. But you're kind of stuck though, right? You can't really afford to sit Alvin Kamara. There's really not a reason to, but what really worries me a little bit is the involvement and usage of Latavius Murray last week also. He had the most carries he's had since week 4 and also saw more targets than Alvin Kamara. What? How is that even possible? Now, a matchup going up against the Broncos, who allow right on 17 fantasy points per game, I got to cross my fingers and just hope that they kind of rebound Alvin Kamara. They need him in this offense to continue to make a run throughout the season. Because honestly, it doesn't sound like there's a chance that Drew Brees comes back this year with the amount of injuries he sustained. And we're probably looking at Taysom Hill for quite a while. They need to involve Alvin Kamara more, and I'm expecting it a little bit more here this week. So we'll start Alvin Kamara. For Denver, this matchup isn't good. I'm not going to lie to you. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. New Orleans is number 1 in the NFL against opposing running backs, allowing only 12.5 fantasy points per game. But this backfield in Denver last week, in week 11, is what I expected them to look like in week 10 when I was a lot higher on them. Last week, Melvin Gordon, 15 carries, 84 yards, 2 touchdowns. And Phillip Lindsay, 16 carries for 82 yards. Very productive from both guys. Now, Drew Lock continues to struggle, which means they could continue to rely more heavily on the running backs in this backfield. Who finds the end zone this week? That's the guy that we want to start. So that's what we do now. We throw blind darts. And this week I'm throwing it on Melvin Gordon. Obviously, the touchdown upside is still a little bit higher for Melvin Gordon. Once they get inside the red zone, inside the 10, they're looking more the way of Melvin Gordon, and that touchdown upside is what's going to give him the slight bump for me here this week. Chiefs and Bucks, and honestly, same story here in Kansas City that we've been saying for the past few weeks, ever since the arrival of Le'Veon Bell. I'm going to continue to start Clyde Edwards-Helaire in this backfield until they give us a reason to not do it. And honestly, Bell's just not seen enough touches to make me worry that much. He did find the end zone last week, but CEH had arguably his best game of the season. Difficult matchup, though, going up against Tampa Bay. They're number 2 against opposing running backs, allowing only 13.5 fantasy points per game. However, it's the Chiefs, it's Patrick Mahomes, it's Andy Reid, it's a successful running game. I'm starting CEH once again this week. For Tampa Bay, I told you last week, you can't trust Bruce Arians. I was almost verbatim last week that the last time that Ronald Jones had a huge game, the next week Leonard Fournette came out and out-touched him. It happened once again this past week, a huge week 10 for Ronald Jones, almost 200 total yards. Comes out week 11, he was out-snapped by Leonard Fournette. I don't get it. I mean, everybody out there knows I am not a Rojo truther by any means. And yes, he makes a lot of stupid mistakes. But so far, on the season, when given the opportunity, Ronald Jones has looked better than Leonard Fournette. I just don't understand the play calling and the usage here in this backfield whatsoever. Kansas City allows right around 19 fantasy points per game, but there's no consistency in this backfield whatsoever. There's no faith in either one of these guys. Honestly, I'm going to have to throw another dart. And this one may be a surprise for people. It may not be a surprise for people, but here we go. Throwing a blind dart on... It's going to be Ronald Jones. Like I just said, he has been the better running back in this backfield for the length of the season. Yes, he's made a lot of stupid mistakes. The fumbles, the drops, the missed blitz pickups, whatever it is, he has issues. However, he's also produced a heck of a lot more than Leonard Fournette. And in an opportunity like this, going up against the Chiefs, they're going to need that firepower in the running game. I'm going with Ronald Jones this week. Bears and Packers now, and there's nothing better than a great fantasy matchup for your running back to go up against the Packers, unless you got the backfield of the Bears. But I mean, it does sound like they should have David Montgomery back, but that offensive line is horrendous. David Montgomery only has 2 touchdowns total on the year, and he's yet to rush for more than 89 yards on the ground. It's just a great matchup, though, right? The Packers allow over 25 fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. Now, David Montgomery is nowhere near must start. He's not even high-end running back 2 right now. He's more like low-end running back 2, high-end running back 3 with a little bit of upside. I'm still going to start him because of the matchup that he has and their need for more weapons in this game. What do we see from Nick Foles? How limited is he with his hip injury prior to the bye week? A lot of question marks still in this ball game, but I'll take a chance and I'll start David Montgomery, hopefully as just a flex play for you this week, though. For Green Bay, I'm going to need some help. I need some help from all the Aaron Jones owners out there, because I think on the count of 3, we need to give a collective finger to Matt LaFleur for the way that he uses Aaron Jones. So 1, 2, 3. That's for you, Matt LaFleur, and the way that you're killing the value of Aaron Jones. We saw another 50-50 split. How 50-50 was it? It was exactly 50-50 because they both saw Aaron Jones, Jamal Williams, 30 snaps apiece on week 11. I just don't get it. Now, luckily, Aaron Jones found the end zone and helped salvage a fantasy day, but he's only rushed for more than 71 yards on the season once in a game so far. You can't really afford to sit Aaron Jones, like, ever, really. But going up against the Bears, it's not an easy task. They allow right around 16 fantasy points per game, and if we see an equal split once again and Jones doesn't find the end zone, we could be looking at a fantasy disappointment here in Week 12. Last game of the week, Seattle and Philadelphia, and it sounds like we have a good chance of getting Chris Carson back this week, the first time since Week 7. But Carlos Hyde didn't look half bad last week, right? He saw some decent touches out of the backfield and had 95 total yards and a touchdown just last week. Plus, he was running angry. He looked very healthy for the first time in a long time, did Carlos Hyde. It's really this passing game in Seattle, right, with DK Metcalf when he's not dropping passes, and Tyler Lockett, that really opens up the running game for whoever is really in the backfield for the Seattle Seahawks here going forward. Now, the Eagles, they allow right around 17 fantasy points per game. If Chris Carson starts, he's who I'm starting in this backfield. If he does sit again, then I start Carlos Hyde. It's basically between those two. So yeah, I'm not really interested in Hyde if Carson starts. We've seen this play out in the past, right? If Carson is healthy, he's getting the volume from Pete Carroll. We've seen it way too many times to think that there's going to be a 50-50 split. We just need to wait and see if he's active. For Philadelphia, Carson Wentz is absolutely killing this entire backfield with his lack of efficiency in the passing game. I mean, Seattle's defense is playing a little bit better. A few weeks ago, you could have said, hey, this is just what the Eagles need. A matchup against Seattle to get their offense back on track. But the defense is just improving in Seattle, and it's really going to have to lead to maybe Carson Wentz relying a little bit more on the running game because he can't make it happen in the passing game. Now, Miles Sanders still seeing over 18 touches a game. He's being efficient with what he's doing. He's just struggling getting into the end zone because they're not getting into the red zone very often in Philadelphia. However, getting right around 5 targets a game still gives Miles Sanders that safer floor. Can Philadelphia get a lead and lean on the run this week against Seattle? Doubt it. I honestly don't see it. What we really need to cross our fingers for here this week is a big play out of Miles Sanders to give us that better fantasy day here in Week 12. All right, those are all my starts and sits for the running back position here, Week 12 fantasy football. But first and foremost, we want to make sure from everybody over here at the Fantasy Headliners that we tell you and your families happy Thanksgiving. Try to enjoy it the best that you possibly can. It's been a rough 2020 for a lot of people. Let's make sure that we be thankful for what we do have and go out there and enjoy it the best that we can. But we greatly appreciate the support of everybody out there. If you have questions, comments, leave them down below. Just a reminder, though, this stuff is changing. It's fluid, right, all throughout the week. Our rankings episode and our live shows on Saturdays give the most up-to-date information as things change. So make sure you stay tuned to those. Like I said, we greatly appreciate your support, though. If you enjoy the content, hit the thumbs up button. Consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't. And we look forward to talking to you later. Thanks. Have a good one.